Dr. Rabin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
All right, so opening the kimono a little bit, anxiety is something that I've personally dealt with for the majority of my life. And so today I wanted to pick your brain because we have a ton of mutual friends about that topic. And perhaps before I go into the first question, I got to give a shout out to Dasha for connecting us. So, Dasha, thank you for the introduction here.
Thanks, Dasha.
Yeah.
Miss you. Hope all is well over there.
So, Dr. Rabin, the question that I would love to start with is when it comes to the topic of anxiety, the way we look at it currently, what as a society or what as the individuals, how are we handling this wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's two things really to start with. The first is that we look at anxiety as something that's unique to us individually. And I think there couldn't be a more destructive way to think about anxiety because anxiety is universal to the human experience. Anxiety is a signal to our bodies that something is amiss in our environment externally around us or internally. Something is off. It's not necessarily a bad thing, actually, at all. We are often told that it's bad or that we shouldn't feel that way or that we're not supposed to feel that way or to feel ashamed about the feeling of anxiety. But the single biggest mistake that we tend to make with feelings like anxiety is that the anxiety, or any way that it comes out, the restlessness, racing thoughts, consistent worry, guilt, shame, et cetera, the list goes on, that this is not a good thing. And ultimately, it's not good or bad. It's just something that we all experience. Literally every single person on the face of this earth experiences this feeling. And this feeling is a signal that is supposed to be there to guide us to figuring out why that feeling is there, in short, if that makes sense, right? It's just a signal and that's all. And so I think when we step back and remove the good or bad from the picture and just look at this feeling for what it is, that's the single first and most important thing that we can do as and understanding it as a universal thing that we can do to get to the root cause of it and help us not feel uncomfortable about it anymore, which in fact, for most people, it's not the anxiety itself that's the problem for most people. It's the guilt or the shame that we should not or are not allowed to feel that feeling that actually makes it worse, right? Or that we are out of control of the feeling or how to do anything about the feeling. So that leads to the second most important thing about anxiety, which is that anxiety comes from, or what we call in our Western culture anxiety, comes from trying to control things around us that we cannot control. Yeah. And we only, the way to break this down most simply is that we only have so much attention available to us at any time, right? Many, many people throughout, especially the last 150 years, since the advent of like consumer marketing, have talked about how our attention is our single most valuable asset as humans, right? Where our conscious focus is on at any given time is the single most valuable thing that we have, which is what every advertiser, every marketer wants to capture, right? That's why they have jobs, is because they're good at pulling us in to focus on what they want us to focus on in the way they want us to focus on it. And that can be anything from video games to advertisements, commercials, music, pop music versus classical music, right? Pop music is obviously more well marketed in the marketing standpoint of capturing our attention than classical music or jazz, right? And so even though jazz is technically and classical music technically are much more incredible forms of music than pop, right? From a technical perspective, they're much more stimulating to our brains in positive ways than pop music. So thinking about it from that perspective, attention is our most valuable asset as humans. We only have so much of it at any given moment to focus on one thing in front of us. That's within our awareness, what we call the conscious experience. So if that attention starts to get monopolized by things that we can't actually control, then our anxiety starts to creep up and up and up and up. Every time more of that attentional resource of our focus is spent on thinking about the things in that domain that we cannot control, our stress level goes up and our anxiety level goes up, literally in a linear, or in some cases an exponential relationship with respect to that. The reason why that's so important is because once we understand that these two very simple, relatively simple, basic facts about anxiety, which neuroscience strongly supports, and psychology strongly supports, then what we can do is we can understand how to manage it effectively, right? So then the answer to these problems of how to deal with anxiety more effectively is that once we accept that we all struggle with it and that it's not good or bad, it just is what it is, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And number two, that it stems from devoting our precious, valuable resource of attention onto things that we can't control, then the solution becomes abundantly clear, which is that to solve the problem of anxiety in our own life, we must learn to control our attention and attribute it to things that we can control rather than things that we can't control. Because as soon as we start to focus on things that we can control, one example being our breath, right? Paying attention to our breath. What happens is an instant response of safety and recovery that is literally happening almost immediately from the moment that breath enters into our nose and our mouth and our lungs. What our brain says, usually, and again, this is beneath our level of awareness, this is like a subconscious thing that goes on in our brains. There's a highly evolutionarily conserved loop of information that says, if I have the time, and again, this is below our awareness, so our brain is saying emotionally, if I have the time to pay attention to this thing that I can control, which is the feeling of air coming into my lungs and my nose, my mouth, and then coming out again, I can't possibly be running from a lion right now. Right?
Yeah.
Because if I was running from a lion, there's no way that I would be able to take the time to intentionally focus on air coming into my lungs. And it's the same thing with human touch, soothing touch. It's the same thing with soothing music and meditation and yoga and movement meditation and all these different techniques that are, most of which are very old techniques, like tens of thousands of years in some cases. These techniques work so well and have existed and continue to exist for so long in our culture because they work in this highly conserved neural pathway of safety, which is how we balance our stress response and our recovery response and nervous systems, which is right at the core of managing that anxiety. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Now, oftentimes saying this and putting it into practice is very, very difficult. And I guess first part A of this question is, why do you think it's such a big issue, especially nowadays? And maybe it has a lot to do with that A word you mentioned, but also like for somebody who's just grasping this. Okay, you mentioned breath, you mentioned meditation, but what are some of the pattern interrupts that we can just sort of bring us back to that moment?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So I think that the first question you asked is, why is it so hard?
Yeah.
So the reason why it's so hard is because when we've already been primed to be in a stress state, right? We don't have, for most of us, thank goodness, most of us don't have the threat that we used to have 10,000 years ago or more of a predator coming to kill us, or, you know, us or our families, or take away our food, water, shelter, air, etc. Right? Most of us don't struggle with having to worry about those kinds of actual survival threats on a daily basis. So what happens is that our nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, which is involved in regulating that survival response, the fight or flight or freeze response, starts to get triggered by things that are not actually threat, but perceived as survival threat. So this could be anything from our kids screaming to traffic, to emails, to Slack pings, to the news, to any number of different things that our brains and our bodies start to identify as threat. And our bodies in those states don't know the difference between those threats, which are not actually survival threats. They might be frustrating or annoying, but they're not actually survival threats. And the alternatives, which is an actual survival threat, like running from a lion in the moment, right? So our bodies don't know the difference. It's up to our minds, which is why we have a frontal cortex, to train our bodies to know what is actually threatening and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
That gets down to why this is so hard, because in humans and all animals, the work of Eric Kandel really showed this. He won the Nobel Prize in 2000 for discovering the origin of learning and memory. And what was really phenomenal about his work is that it showed that practice makes perfect, which is something that we've heard for a long time, but don't necessarily internalize. It's the idea that whether we practice good coping strategies or negative destructive coping strategies, like rejecting our anxiety and shoving it down and having it ultimately turn inward on ourselves, as one example, that those techniques that we practice, we get better at doing them. Even if they're bad or good, or neutral, it makes no difference. The more you do it, the better you get and the stronger our neural connections get. And so as those neural connections get stronger, it becomes harder to reset old patterns. It's not impossible, it just becomes harder. And so as we practice doing things one way, and then we realize that doing it that way isn't serving us anymore, we have to make a conscious decision to change our behavior and start practicing something in a new way, which then requires a bunch of effort and ultimately takes us out of our comfort zone, because we have to embrace this thing called change. And the problem with that, while it seems easy from the outset, is that our stress response nervous system, when we're in a fight or flight or freeze situation, and we perceive threat from our environment, or in worst case from ourselves, which is very common in mental illness and anxiety, is that our bodies oppose change. Because change in and of itself becomes scary, and it triggers that fear response. So we cling to this idea of stability, but stability is just an idea. It doesn't actually exist. The whole world and everything is changing all around us all the time. So changing our mindset to embrace change as the norm. Some people have heard the only constant is change as a funny little phrase. It's very true. The sooner we embrace that phrase as truth, the sooner that we stop focusing on trying to maintain this sense of stability, which isn't actually achievable. Stability is an idea that doesn't actually exist. So it's really achieving stability in the way that we think about it. It really means embracing change as inevitable and something that we need to learn to cope with and adapt to as best we can. Because if we learn nothing from evolution, what we are as humans are adapters first. We are the best adapters the world has ever seen. That's why we've risen to the place we have in society. We've literally adapted to every stress. I have no doubt we will adapt to this pandemic in an effective way. We will cope with this if we stick together as a team, working together to do this. Just like every other tragedy, going back to the Black Plague and the Spanish flu, we will get through this. You know, it's just that we have to embrace the fact that we are adapters first, not sedentary couch potatoes first. You know, we're not clinging to the stability of the couch. We're clinging to the change and the ability that we have to embrace that. So that's the kind of mindset stuff that has to happen. Again, being stressed out directly impairs this. So it's constantly like butting heads over and over again. So going again back to the actionable, the best way that we can embrace this and facilitate these interruptions in these negative thought loops and these anxiety patterns and this fear response that's overactive is to practice these ancient techniques of gratitude first, right? So we call this often, and one of my patients actually came up with this term called the gratitude interrupt or the gratitude interception, which is when you start to have a thought that is unpleasant or to think about something in your life that starts to give you the sense of why me, or why is this happening, or, oh God, you know, what is going on here and what do I do about the situation? You find ourselves start judging the outcome before we even have fully appraised the situation. We teach ourselves to do the gratitude interrupt, which says, in this moment, I am grateful for the opportunity of this challenge, right? Not knowing what the outcome will be, not knowing why we're being challenged necessarily, and not judging the challenge as something necessarily, again, good or bad, and applying these ideas of what good or bad is to it before we even know where it's going. Right? So the idea is that we heal by bringing ourselves back to the present. Breath work and soothing touch and meditation and mindfulness and yoga and all these techniques that are so old are so powerful because they're present focused techniques that bring us back into the moment where our decisions actually matter. We can't change the past and we can't change the future. These are out of our control. What we can do is we can use techniques like gratitude practice and breath work and these different things that are some of the simpler practices to bring ourselves back into the present in times of stress and anxiety, and then remind us that we are grateful for being here now, as Ram Dass says, grateful for being in the moment where our decisions matter, where we are in control of opportunity, and where our free will actually exists. And in that present moment, we recognize the opportunity that we are safe enough to make change in our lives that is meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. There's a lot to go on there, and I want to just double click on something a little bit, and this may go down kind of the neuroscience route, but it may lead us some other direction. So this idea where you have this inner voice that's saying, I want a stable life, and this stable life doesn't actually exist. We are constant adapters to change. Is that thing talking to you, your ego? And in which case, aside from the meditation and all of this stuff, which does take time to kind of control the ego, how do you shortcut that thing? Because the ego can grab a hold of you, and I've personally experienced this, and just hijack your day in some cases.
Yeah, so that's a.
Do I have that right, first off?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to think about it. I think that there's no one right way. But I think there are some, I wouldn't call them shortcut strategies, but they're, highly tuned strategies that existed for a long time. Gratitude being a really important one.
Okay.
Because the ego is another way of thinking of the part of our consciousness, of ourselves, the part of ourselves that is clearly focused on survival.
Mm-hmm.
So survival could mean, what do other people think about me? And survival and my reputation, or survival could mean actual survival issues, right, that we're dealing with. But the point is that our ego, and the word ego, is rooted not in the present. It is rooted in the past, and it tries to predict the future based on the past.
Okay.
So if we understand what that is, that experience of ego self, that the ego is trying to protect us, because it learns what it believes danger to be or threat to be, and then extrapolates that onto the future prediction of what coming up in our future might hurt us or might harm us in some way, then it helps us to understand the importance of that part of the brain. It also helps us to understand that we have to balance that part of our brains with the present part of our brains, right? We have to, the future we are only able to influence the outcomes of the future in an effective way that serves us, by taking everything we've learned from the past and then combining that with what we're experiencing in the present. And reminding ourselves of the opportunities to make decisions now that are based on our past, but are not dictated by our past. And that these decisions that we make now have the power to change our future starting now. So the shortcut, if you want to call it that, is effectively are these techniques like self-gratitude, which is an ancient technique that stems from ancient Buddhism and Hinduism and Ayurvedic medicine and tribal medicine, that is, and even going back to Hippocrates. Hippocrates used these practices in his practice of medicine, is really, and many of this unfortunately has been forgotten in Western medicine, but it still now is backed by neuroscience and psychology. And what it does is it allows us to remind ourselves that we are safe right now. And when we're safe right now, again, using things, anything from breath to gratitude to self-touch, right? Putting pressure on the chest or touching the inside of our ear or our neck in nice ways, can, just with your own hands, can rapidly induce a sense of safety in the body that doesn't require anyone else to be there, are all techniques to basically shortcut the brain to remember, and the body to remember that we are safe right now. Can we predict that we're going to be safe every moment in the future? Of course not. Can we predict, or can we change our past to make sure that we are safe in every moment of our past? Of course not. But we can control our safety in the moment. So being able to practice those techniques is critical because it helps to restore balance of the autonomic nervous system, which is this balance between the parasympathetic rest and recovery system, one side of the hardwired system that's in every animal from us all the way back to 300 million year old sea snails, all the way to the stress response, which is the ego focused response that is required and important for survival. It's not a bad thing. It's just that we don't want it to be active all the time, right? We want to be in control of it. So again, coming back to what we were talking about before, using these techniques like gratitude and breath and things like Apollo and other techniques that are very old techniques, loving kindness, compassion, forgiveness, self-love, all of these techniques are like skill sets that we can strengthen just the same way we strengthen our muscles working out in the gym. It's just that if you're not taught the importance of these things and how to practice them and integrate them into your life, like I wasn't necessarily taught all of these things, it took time
Neither
to
was
learn.
I, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think the question becomes for us, all of us in the present moment, thinking about it from the context of your listeners right now who have never heard this, possibly never heard this before. Now that you know and can understand and get a grasp of what we're talking about and why it's so important to seize the moment, which is literally the present time and the only time that we can manifest change in our lives. Will you continue to make the same decisions you've been making over and over and over again? Or will you think about and make a decision to take a different path and see where that new path leads, right? And in some ways, what's so interesting about this is what psychedelic medicines offer us, is they offer us an opportunity biochemically to alter the state of the body to show us that maybe there's not just one path that we've been taking the whole time. Maybe there's 8 feet of powder on top of the mountain and we can ski wherever we want.
First off, I love the analogy of the powder, but you took this in a beautiful way because I was going to ask you about where do psychedelics fit into this. When you're, let's say you have a web of considerations of how to address one's anxiety, at what point do you look at somebody and say, or at what point do you think that psychedelics are the right approach? Or should people consider it?
So that's a really good question as well. And I think that's a question that a lot of us are asking ourselves at a time where trauma in the world and chronic stress are like ubiquitous, right? So I think that
By the way, Dave, if you need to answer that, I can edit this out. That's fine.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. No big deal. And how are you? We're still okay until, is it 10:30 your time? Or
I have 25 minutes.
Okay, cool.
I'm actually on the East Coast, so it's 1:30 my time.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
I have time to. So psychedelics medicines are not for everyone, but I think that, what's more important than thinking about psychedelics from the standpoint of the way we have, experienced them collectively as a society is that psychedelic does not mean crazy 70s dance party. Yeah. It means mind manifesting. And mind manifesting, or the word psychedelic, applies not just to things like LSD and psilocybin and MDMA and cannabis and all these, biochemical mind altering psychoactive substances that are incredibly powerfully used in psychotherapy and unfortunately also recreationally abused, but it also refers to the way of accessing our subconscious in a meaningful way, right? And so what is much more important about psychedelics than the medicines themselves, which are great for some people, but not for all people. For instance, people who have bipolar disorder, any kind of psychotic disorder, and children under the age of 18 are probably, and some elderly folks who have other medical illnesses are probably not the best candidates for psychedelic medicine. That said, the psychedelic experience in and of itself, where we work together either in an interpersonal way or through using breath work or meditation or techniques like Apollo or something that effectively slightly alters your normal ego sense of self, is a process that we can do without drugs, without medicine. It does not require medicine. And it's a process that people can experience on their own with breathwork and meditation. And by practicing, well-known techniques that allow us to access these states, which effectively helps us to see beneath the ego into our subconscious space, the space that, subconscious may not be the best word, but the other way to describe it is beneath our normal level of awareness, which is often what people refer to as like a dream state. And you start to be able to look beneath that normal level of awareness and say, hey, I forgot about all that stuff that was going on down here that I'm not normally thinking about in my default mode, ego-driven, productivity-focused day, where I have all these responsibilities, but that stuff is still there. And that stuff is actually impacting the way that I see myself and the way that I see my family and the world. So now that I know that stuff is there, how can I understand it better, approach it better from a standpoint of self-acceptance and love and non-judgment, and start to pull out some of those things that I used to think were deficits or weaknesses, but are really just vulnerabilities and opportunities for further growth and self-exploration. And how do I use gratitude, going right back to where we were before, to gently pull out that content from beneath my level of awareness and then literally manifest it in my regular conscious awareness of waking life in a meaningful way that allows me to access a more whole version of myself, not a version of myself that is only the version of myself that I believe people outside want to see, or the version of myself that people tell me they accept, or that I'm taught to believe that they want, but the version of myself that's just that much closer to who I really am. And bringing those two versions of ourselves together, because ultimately there can only be one self. And every fracture of self into different versions of ourselves to present to different groups or different people or different whatever situations is another break that has to be resolved. It's another trauma of the self.
Wow. Okay. So that
Gabor Mate talks about this quite a bit, which is really interesting. If anybody looks up Gabor Mate, he's a fascinating physician who also is very experienced in plant medicine, ayahuasca. And this is the philosophy of tribal medicine that's been around for over 10,000 years, that ayahuasca shamans have worked with people to heal them in this way.
So the fractured self is going to be when you and I get together and record around 2. Connect the dots for me here between psychedelics and Apollo, because, or even the states that we've talked about before, because I'm wearing it right now. And I found it to be very, very effective in the past couple of weeks. I've had the chance to use it. But connect those dots for me.
Sure. So when we're in an ego-driven survival state, like we're talking about, our bodies and our minds are trained and practiced to perceive that there is a real threat in our midst, sometimes all the time. That threat could come from something outside of ourselves, or it could come from that sense of fractured self, that I am not comfortable with who I really am because I've been told that who I really am is not okay to be, right? The most common example is when you're a sensitive child and you're loving and caring and sharing, et cetera, and then you get bullied for it, or you get picked on because people take advantage of you for being kind, right? And that's one of the most common experiences that many of us have growing up. That takes a long time to resolve. And that is an example of an experience that creates a fractured sense of self, where we bury our childhood selves. We become afraid of our childhood selves, and we build a fear response to that childhood self that says, this is not okay to be this part of myself and to let this part of myself out into the world, right? So what happens is, as one example of that sort of cultivated fear response, we start to perceive part of ourselves that is literally one of the most fundamental deep down parts of who we really are as a threat. And that sets off that sympathetic fight or flight response in our bodies all the time, which, for lack of a better term or description, it makes us feel unsafe in our own skin. And this is the biggest reason for self-medication and addiction. The single biggest source of addiction and self-medication is this exact phenomenon I just described to you. And it's like one of the deepest and most fundamental traumas that we all face. And some of us overcome it without falling victim to substance abuse and because we find other things to distract ourselves, like work or relationships or video games or what have you. And then others fall victim to substance abuse and gambling and things of that nature, which are much more destructive. Terence McKenna talks about this in his book called Food of the Gods, which was written like 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And if you read this book, it's like talking about what's happening today. It's incredible. And so where Apollo fits in is that Apollo is a wearable technology that delivers this gentle vibration to the skin that we figured out in our lab at the University of Pittsburgh could effectively remind the body of what it feels like to have someone soothingly touch you, or what it feels like to take a deep breath in a moment of stress or fear, which immediately sends a signal to our brains, as we were talking about earlier, that says, even beneath our level of conscious awareness, it says it to our emotional brains and our amygdala, that fear center in the emotional brain that's in every animal going all the way back to, early reptiles, which is why we call it the reptilian brain. It sends an immediate signal that says, if I have the time to pay attention to this feeling of somebody holding my hand, or the feeling of air coming into my lungs, or the feeling of something gently vibrating on my leg or my arm, that I can't possibly be running from a lion right now. And so the body rapidly calms down and enters, or facilitates entry into that recovery, more parasympathetic dominant state, which is suppressed by the stress response system. And so where psychedelics come in is that psychedelic medicines like Apollo are tools of change. Change is hard when we're stressed out. It's notoriously known to be difficult when we're stressed out, because when we're stressed out and we're in this state of practice fear, or practice perceived fear from our environment, we literally interpret change itself as threatening. So how do you solve that? Well, in psychotherapy, the traditional practice is you help the client feel safe in the office in our presence. You build a trusting relationship with said client, and then that client learns to trust you, to feel safe around you, to be able to talk about their deepest, darkest secrets in your presence in confidence, and then allows us to help them work through those deepest, darkest secrets and traumas, and then help them figure out constructive ways to move forward. But again, that still requires them to practice and make change in their own lives on a regular basis without us there. So Apollo came out of this idea of, how do we give these people something when they leave the office that can be a constant reminder that you feel safe enough. If you feel safe enough to feel this vibration, you feel safe enough to make change in your life. You feel safe enough to be present in your moment, in this moment with your body, and recognize that in that moment of safety, you're also offered a moment of pause, which creates awareness, self-awareness, but also awareness of the opportunity to make a different decision. And that's exactly how psychedelics work. Psychedelics, through the curation of a safe experience, again, safety being the key word here, that safety triggers that recovery response nervous system to turn on, which then biochemically, through the catalytic process of what the psychedelics are doing chemically to our brains and our bodies, reminds us to be aware of the opportunities right in front of us in the present moment to make a different decision for our health and well-being that's aligned with our goals, not necessarily just following the same pattern that we've been following for days, weeks, months, years, decades, our entire life that hasn't been serving us, but to actually recognize that there is a different path that we actually can take, and it starts right now.
Amazing. A technical question about the device itself. The wrist and the ankle versus other aspects of the body. And I was just kind of, trying to figure out why. I know you have a lab and you've probably proven that they're most effective there, but how did you come and arrive to those two particular points?
So we originally, it's actually not that exciting an answer. We originally came up with those locations of the body because they were the easiest locations for people to wear. Originally we tried the wrist and the chest in the lab, and what was interesting was we noticed there wasn't that much of a difference between the chest and the wrist in terms of the way the body interpreted the experience. It was almost identical. We ended up choosing the ankle because we had a patient with Parkinson's disease who tried it on his ankle and had a dramatic result, and then that forced us to make a strap for him. And then I started using it on my wrist in therapy when I was as a therapist working with patients. And I realized that if I was calmer in the sessions, no matter what was going on in my day, that my clients felt better and we had better outcomes. So I sit with my legs crossed and I was resting my wrist on my ankle, and I felt it through my ankle more than I felt it through my wrist. And I was like, wait a minute, this is way better when I feel this through my ankle than my wrist.
Yeah.
So what if we started using it on the ankle instead? And then through the client with Parkinson's, we started to make ankle straps, and we actually tried it. And it turns out, I think 60 to 70% of people actually prefer the ankle.
Yeah, because I have it on my ankle right now. And
yeah, me too.
because, you have different wearables usually on the wrist. And so it's a nice thing to have an alternative on the ankle. But you've noticed that it's more effective generally for people on the ankle versus the wrist?
Subjectively more effective.
Okay.
So I think people tend to enjoy the experience more on the ankle. Mm-hmm. But we don't have, the clinical data looks relatively the same so far. We haven't seen any significant clinical differences that show the ankle is better than the wrist. The only time that we have seen anything that's really meaningful is with sleep, because mm-hmm. I think people don't like to have anything near their head that's making any kind of sound or anything like that when they're sleeping. And if you have something on your wrist that's vibrating when you're trying to sleep and you put it near your head or underneath your head, then, or your partner's head, then they could feel that, and that might be disturbing. So I think the fact that it works the best for sleep on the ankle, and sleep is one of our biggest use cases that people really use Apollo for, has been a big driver of ankle usership.
Amazing. Dr. Rabin, I know, and I'm cognizant of time here, and I know I'm going to have a round 2 with you hopefully in the future. So I want to transition into a final 4 rapid fire questions, if it's okay with you.
Sure.
So what's the book which has most significantly impacted your life?
That's an easy one. It's Eric Kandel's autobiography. Eric Kandel, as I mentioned earlier, won the Nobel Prize for discovering the origins of learning and memory in 2000. He escaped the Holocaust and experienced very significant trauma in his own life, and then effectively figured out how to cope with that and became an incredible force in the field of science. And I think what's so impressive, and his autobiography is called In Search of Memory. Mm-hmm. And it's a fantastic book. And I think what's really incredible is it's told from his story, which is like a firsthand storytelling perspective. He's a great storyteller. But I think what's really amazing about Eric Kandel's writing is that he doesn't say, he's very open and honest. He doesn't say, this was me, I did all this, and look how great I am. He literally names every or almost every person along the way who made his discoveries possible. And I think that is something that is so important for us to always remember, is that we don't exist in a vacuum. We exist in a community with many, many, many other people working towards ideally common goals in some cases, and dissonant goals in other cases. But ultimately, it's up to us to break down those silos between these different disciplines in our society, between science and business and medicine and marketing, and really pull out the best of all of these different groups and pioneers and skill sets, and try to come up with a better system that works better for everyone. And Eric Kandel's work was really inspirational on that level for me.
Amazing. What's the thing that excites you most about the health world at this moment?
So I think the thing that excites me the most is, getting back to something that we didn't really talk about that much yet, but this convergence of disciplines, right? So mm-hmm. What we're seeing now is like breaking down the silos of Eastern and Western medicine being what used to be thought of as opposing disciplines in medicine to complementary disciplines in medicine, and mm-hmm. seeing the convergence between not only Eastern and Western medicine, but also tribal plant medicine with wearable technology and the insights that can provide, and psychedelic medicine and AI, right? And really trying to understand, again, not how just one of these things works independent of all the others, but how the best features of all of these things come together to create a better system for all of us that really supports, on the whole, the needs of humanity, not the needs of Americans or the needs of Mexicans or the needs of like siloed groups of people or the needs of minorities, but the needs of humanity, right? We are literally on the verge of a digital and psychedelic revolution with wearables and psychedelic medicines and psychedelic practices in general that is hybridizing Eastern and Western medicine to just create a more complete view of what healing is. And that is so exciting. And the opportunity to be able to be a part of that research, to be able to be a part of that clinical practice and the way we as a community usher these treatments, these groundbreaking treatments into our culture to, you know, create, as an example with MDMA, potentially the first ever cure for a mental illness. I mean, what could be more exciting than that?
It's amazing. And it's great you're right in the center of it. You're setting yourself up for many future recordings of episodes, Dr. Rabin. What's your top trick for enhancing focus? You may be a little bit biased here.
I think I am biased towards Apollo because as a kid who would have been diagnosed with ADHD, who was not treated with any medicine because my parents didn't believe in it, I always struggled with attention and focus for extended periods of time. And I will extend that to the caveat of I have no problem focusing on things I enjoy focusing on for an extended period of time, but it's the things that I don't necessarily find immediately interesting that create the biggest challenge. And that's really the case for most people who have attention issues in general. And so for me, having Apollo was, when we first developed the prototypes that were wearable that I could use in my day-to-day life, that was such a game changer because instantly I had something that I could literally just press a button and I'm in the zone for like 2 to 3 hours. That was really, really helpful. I can't tell you how helpful that was for me, and having that in the end of my training was really just had a dramatic impact on my ability to perform well, and also be at my best in very difficult, trying situations like working in the psychiatric emergency room for 14-hour shifts, right? Like these kinds of things are very, very difficult for us emotionally, mentally, physically. So having that was incredible help. I think that the other thing that really helped, which is maybe more meta, but still very important and probably the most important of all, is recognizing that attention, focus, and concentration are these incredibly valuable things that we have and that we have the ability to train them. And that was something I learned, I think, in large part from the work of Eric Kandel again, and understanding that, like working out in the gym and training our muscles and our endurance and our cardiovascular system, we can work out our minds and we can work out our attention and our concentration by teaching ourselves how to focus. And there are certain ways of doing this that are better than others. There are certain ways of learning that are better than others. Look at Jim Quick as one example, right? Like there are people who have come up with very successful methods for learning and memorizing things, and not just learning and memorizing, internally understanding phenomenon and integrating them into a greater understanding of the world and ourselves, right? Not just memorizing it for the time being, right? So we can do well on a test. And so I think for me, learning how to learn and learning that, learning is not something you're born with. Concentration is not something you're born with. It's something that you actually, it's up to us to train. It's up to us to understand that we can train these skills, and that by training these skills and practicing how to train these skills, we get better at them. And then we actually improve our memories and we improve our focus over time, and we improve our capacity to take on much more complex and difficult projects or endeavors of any kind, whether that's raising a family to starting a business. All of these things, like that whole idea of really deeply internalizing, accepting that we have the ability to train ourselves in this way was game changing for me, and I think for all of us, when we recognize that we have this ability, it opens up all these doors to say, well, if I have this ability, how do I make the most of it? Right? So that was a huge step for me, which cognitively really shifted the way that I saw myself and my own abilities, from being a kid who's just always distracted to being a kid who actually does have some agency and ability to control the way he feels or thinks in the given moment.
Amazing. Where can people find out more about you?
So probably the best place is my personal website, which also links to my clinical practice. I'm a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist by practice, and I see patients currently. So you can find out more about me and my practice and the different work that I do on drdave.io. And then you can reach out to me there via email, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at Dave Rabin, or on Instagram at Dr. David Rabin. And if you want to learn more about Apollo, you can find us at apolloneuro.com or at Apollo Neuro on Instagram and at Apollo_Neuro on Twitter.
Dr. Rabin, this is the first of many conversations. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
To all the superhumans listening out there, check this one out on YouTube or wherever you're listening to podcasts. Thank you.